The great bells of the cathedral toll through the night, slow, heavy, and final. Their echo seeps through the stone walls of the castle like a warning. Behind those walls, in a candlelit chamber draped with crimson and gold, a young bride trembles. Her silk gown weighs upon her like a chain. The jewels in her hair glitter, but her eyes are hollow, two frightened mirrors reflecting a fate she cannot escape. The servants whisper prayers outside the door, their faces pale. Somewhere below, the hall still hums with drunken laughter. Lords toasting the union, women clapping to the rhythm of the lute, unaware of the terror rising in the heart of the girl above them. For her, the wedding feast has ended. The waiting begins. The air is thick with incense and dread. The room smells of roses and fear. A marriage bed stands ready, not as a symbol of love, but of proof. For in this world, a woman's worth is sealed not by her vows, but by her blood. She clutches her rosary, though even prayer feels hollow tonight. She was told this was her destiny, to serve her husband, to bear heirs, to keep her virtue untainted. But no one told her what it would cost. No one told her how the night of her wedding would become the night of her surrender. Because in the medieval world, marriage was never just a union. It was a transaction, a contract written in flesh and sealed with pain. And the wedding night, the moment that should have marked the beginning of love, became instead the trial that measured obedience, purity, and control. Why did so many medieval brides fear the night meant to seal their union and their fate? Tonight we open the doors of the bridal chamber and step into the darkness that history tried to forget. In the medieval world, love was a luxury few could afford. Marriage, that sacred bond celebrated in hymns and sermons, was rarely about hearts meeting. It was about power, about land, lineage, and the endless chess game of dynasties. Every union was a transaction, every bride a signature on a contract written long before she could read. For noble families, a daughter was not a person but a bargaining chip. Her hand could seal a treaty, end a feud, or secure an alliance that might protect her father's realm. Her dowry, gold, land, or cattle, was the price of her worth. The church blessed these unions, not for affection, but for order. The bride's will mattered as little as her childhood dreams. At 12, a girl could be betrothed. At 14, she could be sent away, dressed in silks, veiled in white, to stand beside a man 3 times her age. Her wedding day was not a beginning, but a transfer of ownership. One moment, her father's property. The next, her husband's. Her consent was presumed. Her silence was agreement. The chronicles speak in soft tones of holy unions, but between the lines lies the truth, fear, duty, and resignation. Behind every smile in a wedding painting was a trembling hand clutching at courage. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of her age. At 15, she was married off to the King of France, a man she barely knew. Chroniclers wrote of the splendor of their ceremony, the golden procession, the songs of the clergy. But Eleanor's letters tell another story, a life lived under the weight of politics, a crown colder than iron. She was not chosen for love but for land. Her vast inheritance was worth an empire. When that marriage soured, she was traded again to the future King of England, or Isabella of France, sent as a teenage bride to King Edward II. Her marriage was meant to secure peace between England and her father's kingdom. Instead, she entered a court filled with suspicion and humiliation. Edward's affection belonged to his male favorite, and Isabella became a symbol of political tension, a queen in name, a prisoner in practice. These were queens, powerful, educated, adorned in jewels, yet even they were powerless in their own chambers. If such women trembled before their husbands, what hope had the peasants' daughters who were married off for a few coins or a patch of land? In the cottages and manors alike, the same ritual unfolded. Fathers chose husbands, priests blessed the vows, and the bride lowered her eyes, swallowing her fear as she whispered the words that would bind her for life. There was no courtship, no quiet moments of affection. A wedding meant obligation, not affection, survival, not happiness. Even among the poor, marriages were arranged to merge farms, share labor, or settle debts. Love, if it came at all, was a fragile seed growing in the shadow of necessity. The world told women their duty was sacred, to obey, to serve, to bear sons. The church taught that a wife must submit, for her husband was her earthly lord. In sermons, priests compared marriage to a holy chain, binding the woman to her rightful place. But behind those sermons were tears, bruises, and unspoken prayers whispered into the dark. Imagine the silence of those medieval nights, the weight of the vows pressing down like iron. The bride lying awake beside a stranger, the scent of wine and candle smoke still in the air, wondering if this was her reward for obedience. Because in that world, the wedding night was not a celebration. It was a duty, an act to prove loyalty, to secure inheritance, to ensure heirs. It was not the beginning of love, but the test of ownership. And when the candles were snuffed out and the castle fell silent, only the bride knew the truth. Beneath the veil, beneath the lace and gold, marriage was never about love. It was about power and surrender. In the medieval world, purity was not a private virtue. It was a public performance. A bride's worth did not end with her dowry or her name. It hinged upon the thin, fragile proof of her untouched body. The moment she crossed the threshold of the bridal chamber, she carried not only her own honor but the reputation of two families. Her body became evidence, and her blood, the sacred seal of her virtue. For centuries, the ritual was known by many names, but all shared one cruel purpose: to prove that the bride was a virgin. On the morning after the wedding night, the bedsheets were inspected. If they bore blood, the family rejoiced, proof that the bride had been pure. If they did not, shame, suspicion, or even punishment followed. In noble courts, the display was theatrical. The stained sheet might be paraded before witnesses, mothers, aunts, even priests, who praised the union's honor. In some kingdoms, servants were sent into the chamber at dawn to verify the proof, their eyes lowered in false modesty. In others, the newlyweds were escorted to bed by torchlight in a ceremony known as the bedding ritual. Guests would cheer, drink, and joke as the couple was undressed, blessed, and left to fulfill their duty. For the bride, the humiliation began long before the night itself. Imagine the terror of a young girl, barely 14, trembling in her heavy gown, surrounded by laughter that masked cruelty. The door closes and silence falls. Behind that door, what happens is no longer her choice. The weight of generations demands that she bleed, that her pain become proof of her worth. But not all women bled. Some were too young. Some had accidents or past injuries that broke the delicate veil long before marriage. For them, the absence of blood could mean ruin. Whispers spread quickly in the stone halls. She was no maiden, they would say. Accusations of impurity could destroy alliances, cost fortunes, or lead to annulment. Some women were even killed for the shame they brought. So they learned to fake it. Midwives and servants, often women who knew too well the cruelty of men's expectations, became secret allies. They hid small animal bladders filled with blood beneath the sheets or pricked a finger to stain the linen when the moment came. Others hid pieces of sponge soaked in dye, desperate to satisfy a world that demanded pain as proof of virtue. And yet, even for those who succeeded, the ordeal left scars far deeper than the body could show. The act itself, often forced, sometimes violent, was seen as a necessary horror. A wife's tears were brushed aside with laughter. It is only the first time, they said. Pain was expected, silence was demanded, and blood was celebrated. Among the nobility, the grotesque pageantry went even further. There are accounts of lords and bishops blessing the marriage bed, sprinkling holy water on the sheets as if sanctifying a battlefield. In some regions, witnesses were required to remain outside the chamber, listening for signs that the union had been fulfilled. Some kings, suspicious of their brides or driven by paranoia over succession, forced servants or guards to watch the consummation, turning the most intimate act of two human beings into a public trial of obedience. One chilling account from a 14th century French manor describes how a young noble bride fainted during the bedding ceremony. Her husband, enraged at her disobedience, dragged her back to the bed before the servants. By dawn, the sheet was stained, but not only with the blood they demanded. Even among peasants, where lives were humbler and the ceremonies simpler, the same fear haunted every wedding night. In small villages, mothers-in-law would demand to see the proof, waving the sheets like trophies. If no blood appeared, cruel words or beatings followed. Women learned to cry quietly, to hide the truth behind forced smiles. The church, far from condemning these rituals, often reinforced them. Clerics preached that virginity was the highest state of purity, and that a woman who entered marriage without it defied the natural order. Confessors asked invasive questions. Priests blessed the bedding, calling it holy consummation, though the word holy did little to comfort the trembling brides beneath their husbands' weight. For men, this was triumph, proof of conquest and lineage. For women, it was terror, a night to survive, not celebrate. In this world, pain became sanctified, and humiliation became custom. There was no mercy for the gentle, no kindness for the afraid. A single drop of blood could save a life. The absence of it could end one. And so, night after night, castle after castle, a grotesque performance unfolded across Europe, the ritual of proof, the cult of purity, the worship of suffering disguised as sanctity. The dawn after a wedding was not marked by joy or tenderness, but by inspection and judgment. For in the eyes of the medieval world, a woman's body was not her own. It was property, evidence, and possession. The sheets told her story, and for too many they told it in blood. In the feudal world, power was not merely exercised, it was embodied. Lords ruled not just over land and labor, but over bodies. Every peasant's breath, every harvest, every birth belonged in some way to the master of the manor. Yet among the darkest whispers that haunted the medieval countryside, none stirred more terror than the rumor of droit du seigneur, the lord's right. According to legend, this right allowed a noble to claim a newly married woman on her wedding night, to take her to his bed before her husband ever could. Whether myth, exaggeration, or rare abuse of power, it reflected a real and dreadful fear, that no woman was beyond the reach of her lord's desire. The peasants told stories in hushed tones, of the bride carried weeping to the manor, of the groom kneeling helplessly, forbidden to protest. They spoke of lords who claimed it was their divine privilege, a blessing upon the union, twisting sin into ceremony. Historians still debate whether droit du seigneur existed as law, but what cannot be denied is that men of power acted as if it did. Feudal authority meant dominance over all things within one's domain, and when power is unchecked, cruelty always finds a way to masquerade as tradition. In the courts of Normandy and Gascony, chronicles record complaints from peasants whose wives or daughters were summoned to serve the lord before marriage. In some cases, coins were demanded as a ransom, a redemption fee that allowed the groom to buy back his bride's honor. The message was clear. Her body belonged to her lord, unless he was paid to look away. For the women, this was not politics. It was terror. Their wedding night, meant to mark a beginning, became a bargaining table where their purity was weighed against their husband's loyalty or poverty. And the fear was not confined to peasants. Even among the nobility, the powerful often preyed upon those beneath them. A baron might demand the company of a servant girl after a feast, or a bishop might bless a bride with unwanted hands. The line between rumor and reality blurred, but the suffering was all too real. One chronicler in the 13th century wrote of a lord in Flanders who claimed the right to test the fruit of his orchard. His men would escort new brides to his chambers under the pretense of law. Those who resisted faced punishment, the confiscation of land, fines, or imprisonment. The practice continued until the villagers revolted, storming his manor in the night. They found him drunk, surrounded by terrified women. He was hanged before dawn, his rights ended by the same peasants he had called his subjects. But not all abusers met justice. In Scotland, legends tell of the merchet, a wedding tax paid by peasants to the laird or church to obtain permission to marry. Though officially a fee, many believed it symbolized a bought exemption from the lord's bed right. The tax became a grim reminder that marriage itself was a privilege controlled by power. Even the church, though it condemned the act in words, was not innocent. Within monasteries, there were priests who preyed upon the faithful. Nuns, supposedly brides of Christ, were often violated by the very men meant to guard their chastity. Abbots and bishops took concubines, confessors exploited penitents, and holy vows were broken in silence. Behind cloister walls, sin flourished under the cloak of sanctity. One tale from Burgundy speaks of a noblewoman who sought refuge in a convent to escape her husband's cruelty. But her safety was short-lived. The abbot, intrigued by her beauty, forced himself upon her under the claim of spiritual guidance. When she resisted, he denounced her as possessed by the devil. She disappeared from the records soon after, another soul erased by the hypocrisy of men in robes. Everywhere the same pattern repeated, power using sanctity as disguise. Lords justified their lust through lineage, priests through holiness, soldiers through conquest. When war came, whole villages were turned into hunting grounds for the victorious. Rape was not a crime, it was a right of victory, a grim echo of the same feudal arrogance that poisoned wedding nights across Europe. During the 100 Years' War, when armies marched across France, women often prayed not for victory, but for invisibility. Brides were hidden in cellars, marriages delayed until the soldiers passed. For to be seen was to be claimed, and to be claimed was to be broken. And still, beneath all this darkness, the rituals continued, the feasts, the songs, the vows. Society clung to the illusion of sacred marriage, while its foundation rotted with exploitation. The very word possession in marriage vows, to have and to hold, became literal in the hands of men who saw women as trophies of conquest. Even in the glittering courts of kings, the pattern remained. Courtiers traded their wives and daughters for favor. Monarchs took brides as pawns, mistresses as rewards. The bedding chamber was no longer a place of love, but of diplomacy and dominance. Consider the court of King Henry VIII, long after the medieval age, but born from its same bones. His wives entered their chambers beneath the gaze of servants and courtiers who were told to report if the union was consummated. Even queens, crowned and adored, lived under the shadow of inspection, their private nights becoming political evidence. In this world, no veil was thick enough to hide a woman from power's gaze. A bride was not a beloved, she was a body, to be verified, used, or exchanged. And every rumor of the Lord's right, every whispered tale of a bride taken by force, carried the same message, that love could never bloom where fear reigned. So, whether the droit du seigneur was law or legend no longer matters. It lived in the hearts of those who feared it. It shaped the silence of brides, the trembling of grooms, the prayers whispered in the dark. It was more than a right. It was a symbol of how absolute power devoured the sacred, until even the wedding bed became a throne of humiliation. And as dawn rose over those feudal lands, the echoes of that right, the cries, the silence, the shame, still lingered in every castle hall, in every village where a woman dared to dream of love but was taught only obedience. In the medieval world, even the most private moments between a husband and wife were not truly their own. Every touch, every sigh, every act beneath the sheets fell under the unblinking eye of the church. From the altar to the marriage bed, faith shaped desire, and turned it into something both holy and shameful. The church taught that marriage was a sacrament, a sacred bond ordained by God. Yet, in the same breath, it declared that flesh was weak, that desire was a doorway to sin. Priests thundered from their pulpits that lust was the whisper of the devil, even within marriage. Love could be tolerated, but pleasure was suspect. The faithful were told that the act of union was allowed only for one reason, to create life. Anything else was indulgence, impurity, or damnation. Virginity was exalted as the highest form of holiness. To remain untouched was to remain closer to God. The Virgin Mary became the unreachable model for all women, pure, silent, and obedient. But the cruel irony was that while virginity was glorified, marriage was demanded. Women existed to reproduce, and yet were told their purity made them sacred. Thus, every bride walked a tightrope between sin and sanctity, between being too chaste and not chaste enough. Confession became another form of control. Behind the wooden screen, Priests asked questions that pierced deeper than the soul. They inquired not only about faith, but about the bed, the positions used, the days chosen, the thoughts felt. Some clerics demanded to know if couples found pleasure in their act, for pleasure, they said, was a sin unless dulled by duty. The church's writings went even further. Manuals for confessors listed forbidden acts in cold, meticulous detail. No intercourse on holy days, no intimacy on Sundays, Lent, or feast days, no pleasure sought during pregnancy or menstruation. Certain positions were declared unholy. The woman on top was considered against nature, a reversal of divine order. Passion itself became rebellion. For women, this moral cage was suffocating. A wife who refused her husband's advances could be accused of sin, but a wife who desired him too eagerly was seen as corrupted. The church told her she must submit, but without enjoyment. She was the vessel, never the participant. Her body belonged to her husband, her soul to the priest, and her will to neither. Some priests went beyond words. There were whispers of tests of purity, conducted by confessors and abbots, cloaked as spiritual guidance but driven by lust. In convents, nuns confessed their impure thoughts, only to be chastised, touched, or violated by the very men who preached chastity. Behind cloistered walls, the line between faith and hypocrisy blurred until both were indistinguishable. Even in marriage, the church intruded with its rituals. Couples were told to pray before consummation. Some priests blessed the marriage bed, sprinkling holy water as though purifying a battlefield. Others warned that sex during daylight was sinful, that laughter or joy during intimacy offended God. The act that created life was treated as a necessary evil, a shadow that even the holiest vows could not cleanse. The fear of sin seeped into every corner of life. Women were taught that their bodies tempted men to damnation, that their beauty was a curse, their desire a weapon of Satan. To be desired was dangerous. To desire was worse. Even after childbirth, a woman was considered unclean until she underwent purification rituals, as though life itself had stained her. And yet, the church profited from this fear. Indulgences were sold, confessions demanded, sermons repeated, all feeding a cycle of guilt that kept believers obedient. The more people feared their own flesh, the tighter the church's grip became. It transformed natural love into penance and turned the marriage bed into an altar of shame. But beneath the surface of sermons and scripture, quiet rebellions bloomed. Lovers met in secret. Husbands ignored holy days. Wives whispered prayers not to saints but to mercy, that they might be allowed to feel joy without sin. For even in a world bound by faith and fear, the heart still dared to want what it was forbidden to have. The church may have sanctified marriage, but it also caged it. It declared the body holy, then shamed it for being human. It called desire a sin, then demanded it for creation. In doing so, it made fear sacred and obedience divine. For in medieval Europe, the bed was not a place of rest or love. It was a battlefield between sin and salvation, where every breath could be judged, every touch confessed, and every pleasure condemned. And when the bells tolled for morning mass, countless women rose from their beds with bowed heads, praying not for forgiveness, but for the strength to survive another night beneath the shadow of God's watchful eye. In the medieval world, the wedding bed was the great equalizer of suffering. Whether born beneath a thatched roof or crowned in gold, a woman's fate was bound by the same invisible chain: obedience. From the lowest peasant hut to the marble halls of kings, every bride learned that her worth would be measured not by her heart or her voice, but by what she could endure. For queens, marriage was diplomacy, a weapon forged in silk and sealed with vows. Every royal wedding was a political contract disguised as a celebration. Behind the jewels, the procession, and the gilded words of priests, the truth was unchanging. She was a womb wearing a crown. When Isabella of Angoulême was married to King John of England, she was barely 14. Chroniclers wrote of her beauty, her youth, her grace. But they did not write of the terror she must have felt when led to the bed of a man twice her age, a king known for cruelty and paranoia. Their union was not love, but strategy, binding lands and power. By dawn, the alliance was sealed in blood and silence, or consider Joan of Navarre, forced to marry the Duke of Brittany for alliance. She wrote later in secret letters that her duty was heavier than her crown. She bore him heirs, endured his rages, and when he died, she was accused of witchcraft by her stepson, her obedience repaid with chains. Even the legendary Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most powerful woman of her age, could not escape the cage of the bed. Married first to Louis VII of France, she was dragged across Europe in political campaigns and treated as an adornment to his reign. When the marriage failed to produce a male heir, she was cast aside, her failure blamed not on fate but on her womanhood. Her second husband, Henry II of England, was her match in intellect and will, yet their union was marked by betrayal and suspicion. Eleanor became a prisoner of her own husband, her body and freedom both used to maintain his throne. For noble women, the wedding night was not the beginning of partnership. It was a surrender to dynastic duty. They carried the weight of nations in their wombs. They were praised when they bore sons and blamed when they did not. A queen's silence was seen as virtue, her sorrow as weakness. But while queens suffered in gilded prisons, the lives of peasant brides were no gentler, only stripped of grandeur. Their marriages were arranged not for politics, but for survival. A father gave his daughter to a man who could plow the fields or pay a dowry, and she accepted without question. Her wedding night was not celebrated with feasts but with exhaustion, a brief pause between work in the fields and the duties of a new home. For the peasant woman, marriage meant endless labor, milking cows, mending clothes, tending to children, feeding the husband who now owned her body as he owned his oxen and land. Her wedding night was less a ceremony and more a confirmation of ownership. She had no choice, no sanctuary, no witness. Her silence was her safety. And yet, even queens could not escape that same silence. Across the centuries, noble or common, women learned the same lesson. To endure was holy, to obey was survival. Some royal wedding nights were not only cruel, but deadly. In the courts of Europe, whispers tell of brides poisoned before they could bear heirs, victims of intrigue and ambition. One chilling story speaks of Beatrice of Burgundy, whose new husband suspected her of being unfaithful even before their vows. On their wedding night, he forced her to drink a potion to cleanse her body. By morning, she was dead. Her death was ruled divine punishment. Others faced a slower kind of death, the kind that began with forced consummation. When Mary, Queen of Scots, married Lord Darnley, their union began with passion and ended in horror. Darnley's jealousy turned violent. Within months, he publicly humiliated her, then joined conspirators who murdered her secretary in front of her eyes. The same night, he demanded his rights as husband, a final act of power disguised as love. Even among the peasants, where the church and lords loomed less visibly, violence was never far from the marriage bed. Wives who resisted their husbands' advances could be beaten without consequence. Those accused of infidelity were shamed in public, sometimes paraded through the village in chains. If a peasant bride could not produce sons, her husband might send her back to her family, her value spent. There were moments, of course, when affection grew from the ashes of duty, when a husband showed kindness, when love dared to survive despite the world's cruelty. But these were exceptions, brief flickers of warmth in a landscape of fear. The medieval world taught women that their obedience was sacred. The church called it virtue, men called it loyalty. But obedience in truth was the currency of survival. Queens obeyed kings, peasant wives obeyed husbands, and all obeyed the silent law of the age, that a woman's body was not her own. From the grandest cathedral to the humblest hut, the story repeated, different walls, same sorrow. A crown could not protect a queen from the tyranny of the marriage bed any more than a peasant's rags could shield her from the Lord's gaze. For in that world, the veil was not a symbol of purity, but of possession. It marked the moment a woman disappeared into her husband's shadow. Whether she knelt before an altar of gold or a wooden cross, the promise was the same: to serve, to submit, to obey. And as centuries passed, countless brides, queens, and peasants alike learned that the price of obedience was always the same. It was the death of freedom, paid in silence, night after night. For centuries, love began in fear, and power wore the mask of devotion. The wedding night, once blessed by priests and celebrated by kings, was not the birth of love, but the burial of freedom. Behind the silk curtains and the hymns, beneath the holy vows and trembling hands, something ancient and cruel endured: the belief that possession was love and obedience was virtue. In the flicker of candlelight, a bride's silence became her prayer. Her body, her will, her future, all surrendered in the name of duty, faith, or peace. From castles to cottages, the ritual repeated itself, as if the world were determined to prove that love could not exist without power. The church taught that marriage was sacred, but sanctity often hid submission. Kings claimed divine right, and husbands claimed divine authority. A woman's tears were seen not as protest, but as part of her purification, her entry into the holy order of suffering. The union of man and wife was meant to reflect the bond between Christ and his church, yet one was nailed to the cross of obedience, while the other claimed salvation through control. And though centuries have passed, the shadow of that night still lingers. The language of purity, the weight of expectation, the myth of the perfect bride, all echo the same ancient fear, that a woman's worth must be proven through surrender. Even now, in different forms and words, the old vows whisper through generations, in families that still prize chastity over choice, in traditions that demand obedience over love, in systems that still teach women to say yes, even when their hearts cry no. The chains have changed shape, but not their sound. What began in candlelight and silence has followed humanity into the modern world. The wedding bed, once a battlefield of power and faith, still carries the memory of those who lay upon it without consent, without hope, without a voice. Their stories were erased, their names forgotten, yet their ghosts remain, woven into the fabric of what we call tradition. We celebrate marriage as the union of souls. But how many centuries did it take for love to mean freedom and not obedience? The medieval bride's fear is not gone. It has simply learned to hide beneath veils, customs, and words of devotion. We inherit her silence every time we mistake control for care or purity for worth. Perhaps that is why the candles of history burn so dimly here, because they were lit by trembling hands. In the end, they called it a wedding night. But for many, it was the night their lives stopped being their own. The music fades. The hall grows quiet. One by one, the candles extinguish until only darkness remains.